Welcome, Fathers.
Abbott and Costello.
How are we doing?
We're doing
So-
fine.
Well,
The better for your asking.
So tell me a little bit about the white papers. Give me the story first. What's the white papers?
Okay. Its origin is the Second Vatican Council. Because in the end of 1965, they issued one of the 16 documents, was on the preparation of young men to be priests. And Cardinal Krol, being the good conservative that he was, meant that he obeyed every rule and regulation. So he decided that he would form a committee to come here to St. Charles for an apostolic visit so that he could have an idea of what we had and what we needed. And the committee was headed up by Bishop Gerald McDevitt, who at the time was the senior auxiliary bishop of the diocese. And he also brought with him Father Henry McCracken, who had once been the Dean of Men and Spiritual Director here. So it was already planned that this would happen. It was scheduled for the end of March of 1966. But what happened immediately before that, on the 15th of March, the Ides, is that there was a walkout of the students from a certain professor who was teaching Scripture.
They're the best teachers, the Scripture teachers.
Well, not then. So the walkout precipitated this, so there was kind of unease here at the seminary. And, one thing follows another. It became like, well, maybe they're out to spy on us and find out what's going on around here. Each of the classes, at least in the college division, which was then called the lower side, there was no college division, decided to write a paper with suggestions for how the seminary could bring itself up to code vis-a-vis the Vatican documents. So each class individually. The upper side decided to take an en masse approach, and so there was one general paper written by the collective theology classes. The first thing to mention is that these documents were asked for. So it was not a rebellion. It was not our Declaration of Independence. And so they were presented to the committee. One of the problems at the time was that we had no rector. The person who was the rector, Monsignor Connery, became ill. And so therefore, there were no vice rectors in those days. So the tradition was the senior priest in age and ordination would take over the running of the seminary. That was Monsignor George O'Donnell, who had been here for approximately 50 years, both as a student and as a teacher, and had never been anywhere else. It was only his only assignment. So he was not used to being the rector. So the leadership was problematic, to say the least. So the committee came, they took all the statements, and they wrote them up as a report, and they brought them back to Cardinal Krol. And then some time passed, so it was the end of March. It was the last week in April, April 25th, I think. And it was Vocation Sunday, which at that time was the second Sunday after Easter, now called the third Sunday of Easter. And we all assembled at the Cathedral for Vocation Sunday. And Cardinal Krol had started this a few years ago. We would have a guest speaker, prayers for vocations, kind of a mass or holy hour. When we arrived at the Cathedral, everyone was hawking the Philadelphia Bulletin, which at that time was the largest selling newspaper in Philadelphia, even more than the Inquirer. And its motto was, in Philadelphia, nearly everyone reads the Bulletin. Well, that Sunday, everybody was reading the Bulletin. Their Sunday circulation was probably over 1 million. And the main article is, Seminary Rebels Against Old-Fashioned...
Stifling paternalism.
Stifling paternalism at the seminary. The problem was that someone had leaked the confidential document, which was asked for, to the newspaper, who of course played it up as rebellion. It's the 60s after all. And so that's what everyone was talking about. And to make it Vocation Sunday made it even more egregious. During the week, Bishop McDevitt wrote a letter to the newspaper commending the seminarians for doing it, explaining how we were asked to do it, and he commented on how well the papers were written and that they would be examined and any changes that were needed would take place. So Bishop McDevitt actually backed the students for doing what they did. He said the only unfortunate part is that a confidential letter should not have been sent to the press. The Sunday after, May 1st, that's when we got a visit from the Archbishop. One of the suggestions was that we should see the Archbishop more frequently at the seminary. Now, in his defense, the previous 4 years there was an ecumenical council going on, so he wasn't seen by many people in Philadelphia because he would be out of the diocese for 4 months at a time. So it was solemn vespers. Monsignor Helduzer was the presiding priest at vespers. And at the end of the ceremony, he got up to the pulpit, and I won't imitate his German voice, but he announced, everyone will leave except the students, because people used to come on Sundays and sit in the back section of St. Martin's to hear vespers, in Latin, of course. Everyone will leave. Your students will be returned to you after the Archbishop has finished with them. I was sitting in the first section, Blessed Mother's side of St. Martin's, and I could see directly into the sacristy. And I saw pacing up and down Monsignor James Connolly, who later became my pastor and my church history teacher.
And let me just clarify, where were you involved in this?
I was further back in the chapel.
Hiding out?
We sat in class order. So I was in the back.
So,
But I had a good view of what was going on.
So I think I nudged someone and I said, Krol must be here, because there's Conley, and you never saw one without the other. So sure enough, the doors were blocked. It was like a papal conclave. And out came John Cardinal Krol. And the first words that he said to us were, and I won't imitate him either because I value my life, is that I read in the newspaper that you wanted to see me. And since I had nothing better to do on a Sunday afternoon, here I am.
It was Charity Sunday. It was where they were collecting money for the Catholic Charities.
And then it went downhill. So he began to tell us, we didn't have hardly any rights at all, basically the right to obey and the right to leave. And then finally he concluded his talk by saying, you have the right to listen to what we say and do what we tell you, and the seminary will not be run by your suggestions, and you can listen to that, and if you do, he would be happy with that. But if not, then we would be expelled, basically. He didn't use those words.
I invite you to stay. But if you cannot, I invite you to leave. At any rate, there is no third option.
That was the closing line, which he did in Latin. Non datur tertium. There is no third choice. So you can either do what you're told or you can leave. And that was part one of the white paper.
Well, before we get to part two, I just want to, so Andy, how long were you in the seminary at this point?
This is my second year in the seminary.
What were your thoughts?
Well, I didn't sign up for this. Basically, we had a very good class, and when we were invited to participate in the visitation by forming a position paper of our own, we used Optatam totius as the guide and made our observations of what was happening in the seminary and what we would like to see changed in accord with the document, that's the way we structured it. And lo and behold, now that kind of structure is what guides seminary formation today. So I think the miracle was that through all this pain, what was set down by seminarians and what was asked for by seminarians is now the modus operandi of the seminary. And so in that respect, you know, I was hopeful that what was asked for would indeed at least be listened to and dealt with, and, you know, the future would be something that we could all live together.
We can part two.
And the following year, I didn't have to worry about it because they shipped me out to Rome.
I did have to worry about it because I stayed here. I give a copy of the white paper. I still have one. And I distribute it to the transitional deacons so that they can read through it just to see the radical things that were suggested. Like perhaps having all of the faculty celebrate Mass for us instead of just the dean day after day, an upgrading in the library, a better spiritual direction, and so forth and so on. So when you read through it, and it was divided by parts, and the parts are actually now the pillars or the dimensions in Pastoris Dabo Vobis. There was the human, the spiritual, the academic, and the apostolic. So it's strange that this is like 25, 30 years before John Paul even issued this document, that the structure of this so-called white paper is the same thing.
So why was Cardinal Krol upset then? Was it the content?
Because it leaked. And B, I think because they were like almost like a threatening notion that this is the way it's got to be because we said so. The theologians tended to be a little more strident than the collegians.
Were you a collegian or a
was a
theologian?
We were both in college. And like we were using words like, we argued over could and should because we didn't want to appear to be too bossy when we were down there. You can't believe, you know, that this should be. No, should is maybe too harsh a word, somebody in the class said. It ought to be. I mean, it was ridiculous. We were trying to get change, but we didn't want to appear to be, you know, like we were calling the shots.
I think, too, you have to look at it as a whole. And in a lot of ways, what kicked this whole off was what he viewed as an act of disobedience. The whole idea of a class walking out on a professor. So therefore, I mean, that seemingly is what kicked it off. And so I think in the Cardinal's mind, you had to look at it as those two things were joined. Because I think there's one thing that, at least from my association with him, he prized the whole notion of obedience, not from a sense of blindness, but a sense of putting your life at the disposal of the church and doing what the church asks of you. And I think that was the edge, if you will, on that first Sunday of May when he spoke. I think it was all of the piece.